Well, detectives, I have to say, there's nothing more pressing at the moment than a particular case that has captured the ire of many fans and journalists, and sometimes in reverse, alike. Highguard. Another hero shooter that dips its feet into a few other genres, like the survival genre, the third-person MOBA genre, or even just more shooter territory as well, and would make their major splash publicly at the TGAs in 2025, just this last year. However, this splash would prove to be a cannonball in a geriatric pool, as the world would just about resoundingly groan out at the same time upon watching its reveal at the TGAs in 2025, with many swearing off Highguard before it even became playable due to its, in their eyes, tepid reception. Well, Highguard would then go through some radio silence before dropping on the 26th of January 2026 on Steam, hoping to put their game where their hype was. Although Highguard was able to reach nearly as many as 100,000 players peak, which is incredible for an unheard of studio, even, if it had veteran developers or not, but that number would bungee jump off of a cliff in just a mere days, falling as low as under 600 players as of the writing of this video, just a month after launch. Look, Highguard is controversial, but is the controversy really worthy of critique, just as the game itself? Or perhaps you're more interested in the story of toxic positivity that seemed to plague both the title itself and the general media coverage of the game. We will cover this and more on this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or dying by utilizing a timeline of events that is filled with clues, developer testimonies, key figures, and most important of all, a sprinkle of detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction sequence where we crack the case for good. Every detective's moment to let everyone else in on the mystery in case they missed the clues along the way. Well, let your high guard down, detectives. We have a case to investigate. The story begins with the major success of a band of veteran shooter developers, Respawn Entertainment, the developers behind the Titanfall series under Electronic Arts' wing. Reportedly developed and tested largely in secret even from EA themselves apparently, Apex Legends was able to avoid suspicions before being shadow dropped for the world to enjoy, resulting in a resounding success for the developers and Electronic Arts more so, as reports would state, earning them north of $3 billion in revenue. This would allow Respawn to claim both artistic and financial success, or at least so many of the original developers had thought. According to Jason Schreier's reporting, many of the original developers were in fact disgruntled, because although the game would reach incredible successful heights, but many of the developers saw next to nothing to speak from about that. This would motivate many of them within just 5 years to depart Respawn Entertainment, also citing issues with not enjoying being under the boot of Electronic Arts, such as things like creativity constraints. One of the many major departing figures was none other than Dusty Welch, who was the GM on Apex Legends, and Chad Grenier, the lead scripter for Apex Legends, a former founder of Respawn Entertainment as well. These two would go on to found Wildlight Entertainment later on. Development for their next title would begin before the studio was technically founded, as they would, according to reports, come up with a new video game idea just about every day until people would start to eventually arrive at what would later become known as Highguard, though it was originally known as Mythic. The initial team was just as small as 6 people, and the process for the next game would actually come from another developer that worked on Apex Legends as well, Carlos Pineda, a lead designer on the upcoming unannounced and undecided project. He would ask the question, hey, do you guys know what Rust is? Which sounds very, how do you do, kids? But anyway, this would actually become the basis of their main game idea. However, this idea about 2 years in, according to Jason Schreier's reporting, would take another form. The more modern form of the game due to complaints about wanting the game to be more competitive. They also felt that the scope for what they wanted originally for the game was just too big and settled on what would later become known as Highguard. The concept of raiding a base would remain salvaged and form the basis of what the game would be built on, regardless if the rest of the game was now missing. Wildlight Entertainment officially would form as a studio sometime in 2023, announced publicly February 16th, 2023. Led by the same industry vets we cited from Respawn Entertainment, and bolstered by even more former Apex Legends and Titanfall talent such as Jason McCord, who worked as a design director on Apex Legends, Mohamed Alavi, a former lead-level designer at Respawn, and a number of other artists and developers such as Robert Robe, Josh Sobel, and more. This would bring their overall development team up to around 100 developers by the end of development, 60 of which having been prior Apex Legends and Titanfall developers. These developers would make up the bulk team for most of the game's development. If this seems like a huge team for a new studio, it is, though some of the blow is cushioned by the fact that the studio was supposed to be fully remote, and thus would save the cost on having to have a HQ that everyone had to relocate to. Though if you're like me, you're probably wondering, even before the recent events, how on earth were they going to fund this? I mean, Wildlight Entertainment was claiming to be fully funded even as far back as their announcement, and had over 60 developers. The reason this is relevant is because, well, money isn't free. And in-game development, where it comes from, dictates who the game is being made for and oftentimes how. If you're taking investment capital early on, there's going to be some strings attached to that, especially if they are going to be funding your project entirely, including the development for the next couple of years. But for all public intents and purposes, Wildlight Entertainment was funded. But secretly, as no investor was disclosed at all, this would give off the view that they were indie, which we will find out a bit later that they weren't really. I also wanted to note, as of just months ago, we see a reference to a Wildlight Entertainment studio, which is actually located in Woodland Hills, California, so they actually still have an HQ as well. And then the fateful day of the fateful announcement would come. December 11th, 2025, would be the commencement of one of the biggest gaming award shows out there at the moment, the Game Awards, or the TGAs. This ceremony shows off upcoming titles ranging from indie to high-profile AAA products, though mostly the latter. Jeff Keighley, the steward of TGA, would, after playing Highguard after visiting the Wildlight Entertainment Studios reportedly and being impressed, make a personal decision to place the upcoming raid shooter at the tail end of the TGAs, a spot that's usually reserved for like super high production games that look great on camera. And what came next would go on in internet infamy. Enter the official reveal trailer. John Highguard Atticus was there to greet us in the trailer, monologuing monotonely what sounds like a rally call. What came next was a HUD-less gameplay made to look exciting with no rhyme or reason as to what was actually going on, or what the format of the game even was. The unbelievable amount of expectations placed on the final game at the TGAs was immense, and you can see it in the comments section, echoed around the internet. What the heck was this? Why didn't it look as high production as they had expected, and how did they manage to make a more generic trailer than Concord did? Well, that last one is related to what some developers would refer to as a rush to push a trailer out last second, likely to answer the call at the TGAs. Reportedly, Chad Grenier and team had wanted a shadow launch as they had done before in the past with Apex Legends to great success. But as some developers would stress, they weren't as known, being a new studio, but according to Chad, they were a small indie studio with a limited budget and time, and had no big marketing push to guide them. And thus, this was a gamble that they took, thinking in the end that the most important thing would be simply to, as they said, getting eyes on the game. Not paying attention to the context of what a bad play here could either do to their game or its reputation, or not really receiving the proper feedback ahead of time to even know what you were in for. Reports would come out a month later about how I already mentioned that Highguard didn't even pay for their slot. Jeff took the chance on them for no reason other than he just liked the game and trusted the veteran developers on it. While this might sound like a good thing and a cool gesture, really, Jeff might have just forced a title that wasn't ready for the spotlight to take the spotlight and find themselves burned by the light. Worse, following this public reception, Wildlight Entertainment would go radio silent for weeks before dropping a slew of details and a gameplay breakdown January 23rd, 2026, just days before they were set to launch. So which is it? Are you going to do the shadow launch, or are we actually going to be releasing details? And if we're doing both, then why are we doing it like this, where it's like there's not enough time to actually make an assessment after you drop said details? In an official launch video, Chad Grenier and Jason McCord would take center stage, talking about their desire to make something design-led, where gameplay would always come first. They would also talk about taking major inspiration from survival shooters, especially regarding base raiding. But this wasn't a survival game, Jason would say, and it wasn't a base building game, it was a PvP raid shooter, something entirely new that relied on their level design ability more so, and of course their skills as a shooter-focused team. Look, not only is this bizarre to announce a new genre days before you are set to launch your new game, I've just also not really ever seen creating a genre overnight be a thing. I mean, the biggest, most powerful gaming genres of late, like Battle Royales or MOBAs, were created in custom games of other games, and thus were like first community major efforts. And were first major community efforts before they became commercial games. I mean, you have to see if people even want this to exist first, right? And second, not only did the market not exist, would it even exist? Would it form at all? I mean, I've been playing survival games since they got started, having been playing them since Minecraft was in early stages because, as I've said before, Notch was a former MMORPG developer, and DayZ when it was a mod over a decade ago. But even in more modern times, I have nearly 500 hours in Rust on just one account, and 200 or so on another. Don't ask me why. I can safely say vertical slicing in MMORPG worked for the survival game genre, and thus me and my enjoyment of them, having loved sandbox MMOs. However, I can't imagine that thinking that gamifying a single aspect of them would work as a full-fledged game idea. I mean, think about it. It's essentially just Rust with PvP and base rating, except placed in a neatly wrapped, safe box with no room for variety. You know, the spice of survival games mostly. Worse, the rewards are even more paltry when you remove all the fun, tension, and excitement, and, well, need for the resources in a game like Rust. It really feels like someone who had no idea what makes survival games like Rust tick, and, you know, the more PvP-centric ones, just thought by taking the part that they liked the most, the base rating aspect, they could turn that into a game. But I just don't see it. And I would wager many of my content creator survival gamer bros wouldn't either. So you're not targeting them. They're the actual gamers and audience that you would potentially be roping in. But if you're trying to rope in those that didn't even get roped in the first time, like the more kind of casual on the fringe players, I can't imagine that's like a worthwhile endeavor there. It's like a survival light game. But those already exist and they're not PvP focused. I don't have any other major notes to make except, well, any scene I ever see with like Manny Hagopian, or Hagopian, I'm not sure how you say his name, sorry, regarding the game just gives off these like ancient alien vibes. And no, it's not because of their hair, but anytime they ever talk, I just don't hear anything of value. This is significant because this was the person who's supposed to be getting me to care about the characters in the world. And all they were saying were useless platitudes. Players will discover new story, aka, we haven't made it yet. Anyway. On this video, by the way, obviously confident about what's to come, comments would be disabled altogether. Or how about how when you go to the subreddit and find Chad Grenier there, who for some reason is a mod of their community-run subreddit as it says in the fine print, has a private profile. The lead talking head on the project, no different than a scared internet anon. The difference being is you're an artist, and you're trying to publish art and get people to play it publicly, painting yet more instances of how scared Wildlight Entertainment seemed to be about their new shiny product. The thing is, no amount of toxic positivity was going to make your game resonate with gamers. It had to actually be a good game. So you can try to hide from criticism as much as possible, or just hide behind this veneer that you're going to pull off another Apex Legends, but I don't think it's realistic. Highguard would launch January 26th, 2026, just days later, coming as a surprise to many gamers such as myself. And that's because what would come next is one of the more interesting stories for the year, and it just started. Highguard had no shortage of popularity or interest to start things off, being able to reach as many as like 100,000 players peak. But Highguard would showcase a number of factors in the game industry, and the actual quality and content of the game itself would sort of find itself lost in that debate and fight. But before we handle the game's reception publicly, from gamers and critics alike, I wanted to actually jump into the gameplay and critique it first, myself, so we can kind of get past all of that noise. So was Highguard getting unfair hate? I mean, these were the previous devs that worked on Apex Legends and Titanfall, right? Two games that were highly known for their gameplay. I don't think so. I actually think that Highguard is worthy of the hate that it's getting from an artistic standpoint. I mean, it's a bare bones games as a service that had one mode at launch, no ranked mode, no character or account progression or mastery, and no actual detailed stats. It also bizarrely has a forced tutorial that, by the way, if you ever get DC'd while doing it, which by the way, it kicks you out if you start to AFK, I learned that the hard way, you have to restart the whole thing all over again. It's, what? Anyway, how they handled maps or levels was actually kind of like interesting, at the very least, with the chance of like 5 rotating maps and 6 bases that you could choose from. Highguard worked in a simple way for the people that had experience in the survival gaming genre, but for those that were unaware, could prove to be a little complicating as it kind of blended elements of many different genres together. Gathering, traveling, leveling and itemization, PvP, and of course your skill at raiding a base. Since building isn't really a thing in this game, instead everyone can just reinforce walls. Players would form teams of 3, or queue into groups of 3 in total, fighting 3 other players in a map with the goal of grabbing the shield breaker, a powerful artifact sword, and bringing it to the enemy base so you can assault it. First, you spawn into the game after selecting a base to which you can then choose to fortify it first. Following this, players will go out and roam the map, looking for loot and Vesper, the currency needed in the game to purchase loot. After mining this Vesper and acquiring some loot, once the shield breaker spawns, players must fight over it before then transitioning into the main phase of the game, the raid phase, where players use the shield breaker, as I said, to breach the enemy base, to which then players must apply bombs to topple. My personal thoughts on the concept are as follows. I think it's ass. Starting with the core movement and gameplay, which you will hear many people glaze over and glaze about, which I actually think is a bit of a red herring. That's because the movement and gunplay are nothing like Titanfall or Apex Legends. If anything, they feel like those games if they were World of Warcrafted to sell to a broader or younger audience. The movement isn't as precise as either of those games and offers none of the innovations they did in wall running, mantling, or slide tech. Second, who wants to play a 3v3 raid each other's base on a huge map? The concept doesn't even make sense, unless you realize that someone probably sat in a room and convinced people that in Rust, well, most raids are just with 3-mans, and thus we have a game. When in reality, 3-mans might be the most competitive configuration, sure, but people raid in all group sizes in Rust, especially large groups for safety, let's be honest. Throw into account that some Rust servers have like as many as hundreds of players in them, and you never run out of crazy things to get involved in that game. So then I ask myself, well, why does Highguard exist? And my answer is not going to sound like a very nice one. It's because it feels like someone saw Rust and thought, what if we can control the outcomes and enjoyment a bit more, and turn that into some competitive shooter? That could even be esports, right? The problem is, to do that, you have to create this safe space of content, where you have raids carried out on a big empty map with 3v3 as the team configuration. At least that's how the idea ends up, right? Because you might say, like me, why not just make it multi-team, like, Battle Royales do it? But the argument against that was simple, even if it made no sense. They wanted to control the outcome better for the 6 players involved in a single match. The problem is, as I stated, to control that you have to give up so much. Think Thanos and sacrificing everything. In the end, you're left with a shell and husk of a game, and not a very good one. Besides the lackluster combat and gunplay, you have an incredibly generic character cast, or wardens as they're known in the game, that are hired by the Iron Vault to mine the important resources throughout the world to create, well, immense wealth. Capitalism. I think the idea is that they need to be super agents because it's dangerous there, but it's never really explained why except for, well, PvP. These wardens are worse than Concords, and I will explain why. They lack originality, on top of lacking actual identities. The wardens do very little to show you what the characters are about, based on visuals alone. In fact, ironically, the prestige skin for every character actually accomplishes this, which is ridiculous to hide your character's identity behind a paywall, right? But let's pick some more examples, right? As we always do when we talk about like cast of characters for hero shooter style games. Kai is an ice monk. Why? He doesn't act anything like someone who went to a monastery or is a monk. It just feels like it's like thrown in there. And then Scarlet is this gorgeous character that's supposed to be like Ezio but looks more like Talia from League of Legends. But the game's premier feature character, all over marketing material, is Atticus, or John Highguard. It's just that generic. He's supposed to be this famed warden captain, but all of his abilities are selfish, despite him being a selfless character, supposedly. Showing how conflicted the character design was in Highguard, and well, non-impactful it was. Especially when you only have like the 2 different abilities that can actually make your character unique. I guess not counting your passive. The most redeeming thing of the game is the mounted combat, which allows you to basically play Wild West Simulator, which is honestly pretty rare overall in a multiplayer game and makes the game feel like an old school free-to-play game from the 2000s, which is kind of good and bad. Although the mounted combat is fun, it feels very half-baked despite this, almost like they would have had more value in just pursuing that over the raiding thing, which, sorry for me, is a total non-starter in Highguard. I raid Rust and other survival games for loot, and the chance to enrich my clan. In Highguard, there's no real account progression or character mastery, and since the maps wipe constantly and aren't actually mine, I don't get any of the same base building and defending satisfaction, a classic human feature. It feels like a Disney Kids version of Rust, and considering the kind of game we are talking about, why would anyone even want that? Now that we got through a lot of that noise, let's talk about the public reception of Highguard, which is super important naturally, with a multiplayer free-to-play game especially covering both the player and critical lens. Starting with the player base first. As we can largely track from reading Steam reviews, and to be honest, they are quite hard to parse if we're looking for the actual launch day reviews. There's a ton of troll reviews, recipes, White Knight reviews for some reason, and the actual good reviews were nowhere to be seen. Sure, you see some positive reviews, but in those reviews, most of the players spend more time fighting off imaginary demons than actually addressing the substance of the game, which shows a problem we have in this industry. As much as we have people willing to relieve themselves at the thought of just a major game failing, which is weird despite me creating this series, trust me, there are also plenty there ready to defend absolute trash and eat it up, with no defense other than just stop being a meathead. It's the superfan versus the anti-fan, facing off in a battle for the snoozes. It makes it hard or impossible to navigate as a normal gamer trying to parse if a game's worth it or not, though. In a sense, those trying to defend the game like this end up making matters worse, as players look to actual reviews of the game like me for a chance to see if they should try it out, but they can't find any actual reviews. Remember, players don't have the ability to vote with their wallet effectively, as shown by the amount of defending in my comment section for things like microtransactions or pay-to-win practices for years. And well, of course, many other public instances of supposed boycotts failing epically, especially when a game is free. Meaning if Highguard had quality, hate play or not, people would still be playing the game. Look at League of Legends and their population of the game. They hate it, and yet they play it so much. Oops, guilty. But let's get to the critical reception of Highguard now, which is largely a tepid response, which isn't exactly my point for mentioning it. IGN, for example, would give the game a 7 out of 10, calling the gunplay compelling and enjoying the impressive pace of updates. For a game that launched maybe 60% complete when compared to other modern-day shooters or classic shooters or hell, even Titanfall, IGN would admit even if they liked aspects, there wasn't a lot of meat on the bones, but they saw potential at least. And I'm not gonna lie, I think that this review is really trash. You don't rate a game based on potential when it launches and charges money for things. You rate it based on the product at hand. Comparing Apex Legends to this is not comparable. Apex Legends offered something completely unique from a gameplay perspective. It feels so irresponsible to publish a review like this, especially when a writer like this won't be found to talk about the game if the potential doesn't take off. But the overall reception of Highguard was similar rating-wise, scoring a 63 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic. Well, unleash your Morgan Park, who seems to have made it a career out of always trying to be the pointless contrarian. Hey, this game's actually really good. Hey, this game's actually really good. Okay, we trust you, Morgan. Stellar record, by the way. But for how mediocre the game was overall, this is actually a pretty good media reception. I mean, sure, nobody outright calls the game good, but saying it had good moments or good bones. The reason I think the reception is more positive than it should be is if you compare Highguard to another survival game, like critically, it scores pretty well. Hell, Rust only scored a 69 out of 100, 69, from critics. The problem is, historically, if it doesn't have a story mode in it, critics don't like survival games or sandbox games. These games take time investment and a level of knowledge and skill and teamwork to execute. Meanwhile, check the reception on Steam for Rust, and you get a completely different story, where it hails a impressive 86% rated very positive score from a whopping 500,000 players. The player base has already decided that they love this game. Meanwhile, critics were not convinced. But who cares? They aren't part of this discussion at the core when it comes to a more sandbox-style game, let's be honest. I bet that this is also related to the shock of many Highguard developers at their poor reception publicly, as we will talk more about later. Within days of launching, Wildlight Entertainment would respond to feedback about player counts and introduce a 5 vs 5 mode, which is why I found it hard to parse the positive reviews for the game, when most people were playing and reviewing the game after this change. So clearly, it was wanted and really enjoyed, and maybe even needed arguably. The issue that I have with it is how easy it was to be presented as a solution, offered right there at their feet. Meaning that like nobody in testing ever thought of this before? Seriously? It just seems hard to believe. And if you do believe it, then at that point you have to admit that Wildlight Entertainment wasn't sure what kind of game they were trying to make, which could work if they had legroom to change and make mistakes though. But that's why Chad Grenier, in an interview published post the game's launch, would state that they were most interested in retention and consistent growth for their game as a metric to follow for success, versus reaching a big population. Which kind of seemed confusing when Jason McCord argued the opposite as a reason for why they took the TGA offer, because it was going to bring eyes to their game, which was the most important thing according to him. Chad would then also argue that there wasn't any game like theirs, which had to stand for something. Except as I've stated in my other episodes in the past, creating a new genre is a cool, in theory thing, but it's not only harder than it seems, it oftentimes doesn't even benefit the first person or pioneer in that field, creating a more cascading effect that creates the success from it. The other issue with it is if nothing is like your game, it's a game that's actually made to stand alone and thus fail on its own, collapsing at its own weight. It will collapse due to having the burden of having to be the best and only in its new field it just invented. A heavy burden. Think of a new game style as a new sport. You have to essentially convince people this new sport is exciting and worthwhile, which is not an easy task as you have to penetrate culture to do so at large. That's why the biggest trends in gaming are actually organic and were first led by the gaming communities that back them. You can't force a eureka moment when there wasn't one. Episode 2 would drop for Highguard just days after launching, which honestly just shows how utterly off their marketing was for the game. That's because it wasn't just Episode 2 that dropped, content-wise. They actually dropped the Episode 1 and 2 cinematics for the game, which honestly are pretty good all things considered. It was like they wanted to emulate Overwatch, but pretended that the timing of their marketing somehow didn't matter. I'm memeing a bit, but seriously, how would you guys think that people wouldn't want to see this stuff first, especially if you're not going to shadow drop, especially when it's much better produced and done than the trailers that you've already shown the public? It's like wearing really nice clothes, but not wanting anyone to see them. You know what I mean? This would have been a great lead-in for your game, where you could have slowly built things up and then reacted to feedback as things came. But the chance to do that just never came, when although not shocking to the jackals cackling from the rafters, would be shocking to many, including myself, as the Highguard team at Wildlight Entertainment would be mostly laid off, with less than 20 developers remaining, meaning over 90 potential employees had lost their jobs, though they would at least receive some sort of severance in the process. This was shocking to me because this was a studio that talked about how indie they were and how they had content set up for an entire year. Hey, I believe them. But if you're already having to pack things up and have to fire more than 80% of your workforce, it means that something else is at play. Either poor management or the funds were drying up. But before we cover the mysterious funding behind Highguard, we will talk about some of the fallout that came from the development team being let go. In these interviews and tidbits, we can find some major clues. One of these major departures that was quick to speak their piece was Josh Sobel, a lead technical artist on the game. Josh would state that the future had seemed bright for Highguard, and developers were calling the game lightning in a bottle. Josh would continue to list more platitudes people levied at the game and project quite highly. But then Josh would turn quite bitter, as he would then start to highlight how the game never seemed to have a chance, and was turned into a joke from minute one. This was regarding people feeling that the game had purchased its final slot on the TGAs, which apparently was actually quite normal. Josh would then state that products were at the whim of their consumers, and he felt that those consumers had slandered Highguard past repair. Josh would continue to highlight the slew of negativity that the game would face, but before covering that again, I wanted to pivot to something else related. And that's toxic positivity. That's what exists when you don't have people telling you what they don't like. It's actually even more insidious in a way because it gives you little actionable feedback and leaves you vulnerable for a gut punch one day. Kind of like fake martial arts, right? Having read through tons of negative feedback in preparation for this video for the game, I have a different perspective regarding the game, of course, because I'm more of an impartial party. The game's not that good. That's why the good feedback couldn't combat the bad feedback, which is something that you can see in even the most controversial games. There's no good feedback really for the game, at large. It's just mostly empty platitudes, white knighting, and well, the game is kind of good, which is an indictment more so of anything. Quality will always outshine shit talk. Just look at the Witcher series, a series that was originally dubbed Eurojank and ignored by most players. It would eventually become competitive enough with their second game to get broader coverage, and then knock it out the park with their third game. Sure, now in hindsight everyone can say, well, success always seemed likely, but at one point, when I was first playing the game, people didn't even take it seriously. Naturally, people will also use the No Man's Sky example too, where they were able to take a game that launched to a dud game-wise and resurrect it into a pretty darn good game. But the thing that they always forget to mention is that that game still sold well, at a box price. They had incentive and some money to work on the game and fix it. Highguard, on the other hand, was free to play, and didn't have much revenue coming in from a player base that was already in the 1,500 peak player range. So layoffs were likely inevitable, but the fact they came so quickly spoke to something else entirely. In a bombshell moment, a major report would come out from gaming journalist Stephen Totolo, and would state that Highguard was indeed fully funded as they had claimed originally, but fully funded by none other than Tencent, the Chinese gaming publisher conglomerate. This was not only surprising to many, myself included, it was a breach of trust in a sense, as Wildlight Entertainment had been claiming for years they were indie, and meanwhile were funded for at least 3 of those years to create Highguard by Tencent, which is anything but indie. It also explained more of their decision-making, like seeking large amounts of players at once, instead of wanting organic growth over time, and how fast the plug was pulled on things with although the game still being alive right now, it only has 20 developers remaining on it as of the end of February. But it wasn't just a sudden rug pull for Wildlight Entertainment developers. For many of them, it was a rude awakening. According to many sources, the reception at TGA and launch was a surprise to many developers. Reportedly, they had been working with a Tencent-branded consumer research group to take feedback for their game. These feedback sessions were almost always guided by developers, which made discovery for their new players easier, and streamlined their experience in a way that wasn't going to be conducive to how live would play out with randoms playing together. Worse, and let me just be blunt about it, nobody told them creating a new game genre overnight and expecting it to work was going to work. Apex Legends didn't even create Battle Royales. It was 2 years late commercially to the trend, and artistically easily like 7 to 8 years late. The whole taking Apex Legends approach just makes no sense here. And really, that just adds more to one of my strongest hunches concerning Highguard, and that it feels like it was made with a little too much rainbows and sunshine and too much looks great, and not enough, what are we building again? According to developers on the project, hooprize was a major factor for some of the higher-ups especially. Perhaps this was yet again an instance of really talented developers thinking their shit didn't stink, perhaps a little too much. Wildlight would promise that things weren't stopping, however, in a strange roundabout and unceremonious way. Announced on Discord, a Discord, by the way, that when you click on the link for it to their website, it doesn't even work and it links to the wrong Discord. Anyway, according to a developer known as Coronac on Discord, another patch was promised, although no details were released concerning about what would be in the patch. The announcement just felt so half-baked. Was this small remaining team even working on Highguard or another project altogether? I had my doubts and suspicions. Regardless, this was a game that was in the 550 or so player range according to Steam charts, so whether they were pumping what little they had left into it or not, it simply wasn't going to be enough needed to revitalize the game, which is what it would need. No, I'm just gonna say it, and shoot the elephant in the room with the 375. Highguard might have been pretty meh overall, but the worst thing was that nobody wanted it. The music is playing, detectives, and this mystery has come to an end. While Highguard still breathes, it is clearly in my eyes not headed anywhere good from this point on. Not just because of all the hoopla surrounding it, but simply because I just don't believe in the product, let alone their ability to rehabilitate it into something playable. And so, why did Highguard find itself in the death of a game series? Bland and seasonless food. Gas. Vertical slicism again. The target market didn't exist. Toxic positivity, a bizarre marketing plan. And so, the story of Highguard and its wardens is all but at an end now, even just a month after its launch, and I feel confident in saying that. That's what this series is about after all, me making a claim out of confidence and research, no matter what point of the timeline a game might be at, though usually reserved for games that are further along than Highguard, for instance. But not all cases are the same, and sometimes due to covering so many of these cases, we see the same patterns in a title that hasn't been out for very long. And when these patterns are exacerbated by a poor public showing and backed up by the arguments presented throughout this video, well, Highguard will show itself in the death of a game series, right? Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Highguard, if you got the chance to play it, and why you think it should have worked or didn't in case I missed anything. Until the next case, detectives, where we cover an unlikely competitor in the animated racer space, led by none other than a major name in the MMORPG and virtual gaming space. Next on